This is the bandsaw. The bandsaw is actually one of our oldest power machines, even before electricity. You can see a few inches of the blade exposed here, but the blade is actually quite long and runs all the way up on our upper and lower wheels. So this blade is 160 inches long. This bandsaw currently has a 1/4 inch blade in it, 1/4 inch wide. But you can have different widths of blades. In my shop, we have 3 bandsaws, and each one is set up with a different blade. So the yellow Powermatic has a 1/4 inch blade. The blue Bailey has a 1/2 inch blade, and the gray Laguna has a 1 inch blade. It's nice to be able to have those different blades because we use them for different things. But even if you only had one bandsaw, you could still switch out the blades as needed and get the same work done. The bandsaw is great because we can do curved cuts. But the flip side of that is that the bandsaw cannot make perfectly straight cuts. You can cut pretty straight, but it's not going to be as perfectly straight as other machines like the table saw and others. Okay, let me show you some of the features on this saw. Okay, so obviously here we have our exposed blade. We've got our blade guard. It can be adjusted up and down using this wheel, depending on how much blade you want exposed. We have obviously our cutting table. Up front here we have a ruler so that we can make some adjustments to width. This bandsaw also has an adjustable fence. Not all bandsaws have fences, and you could make your own temporary fence as well using scrap pieces. Our on-off buttons are over here. There's also a foot pedal down below that acts as a brake and helps that blade to spin down slower. And it also, as soon as you hit that foot pedal, it will turn the saw off as well. So typically I'll use the on button, and then instead of the off button, I'll just use the foot pedal brake. On the back side here, we've got a couple of adjustments as well. Beneath, down here, we can actually adjust the angle of the table. If I unlock it, then I can turn the wheel and change the angle of the table. Typically, we keep it on 0 degrees, but if it were a special setup, we have the option to change the angle as well. Up above, we've got a couple of knobs here. Okay, this one, if you tighten it in place, then the blade guard cannot move. So typically we'll keep it a little loose so that can be moved. And this lever, knob, and wheel control the inside. So typically we don't mess with those. Okay, let's talk some of the safety guidelines. The biggest danger with the bandsaw is cutting a finger off. So we want to be very aware and very careful how we have our hands positioned and be very aware of where that blade is as we're operating the saw. So we definitely want to maintain our margin of safety and keep our hands and fingers 2 to 4 inches away from that blade at all times. We want to observe what's called the cutting path. So directly in front of the blade, that's the cut path. So I want to make sure that my hands are to the side of it, to one side or the other. Even if I'm moving my hands and rotating them for a curved cut, you just want to make sure that if your hand were ever to slip, that it won't go into that blade. Okay, the next safety feature is your guard height. The blade remains the same, and we just cover up or expose the correct amount of blade. So you want to lower it down until it's about 1/4 of an inch or so above your piece of material. Just lay your material down on the table and bring the blade guard down as needed. You want it high enough that you can kind of see what you're doing, but low enough that hopefully, that keeps my fingers safe and they'll hit the blade guard before they would hit the actual blade. The next safety item is on your curved cuts. So a thinner blade, like a 1/4 inch blade, can make tighter turns. A 1/2 inch blade, a little bit less tight, okay? And then on a 1 inch blade, it's basically straight cuts or very, very gentle turns. So be aware of that, because as you're rotating a piece of material to make a curved cut, if you bend that blade or put pressure on it, then it could cause that blade to break, okay? Or other unsafe things can happen as well. You just want to make sure that if you're making straight or curved cuts, you're not putting pressure on the blade and bending it while it's trying to operate. We always operate the saw from the front. It's common also to have a neighbor helping from the back. And on this saw, it is okay for the person on the back to gently pull to help that material through. We don't want to operate the saw from the right side, even if it feels like that's the most comfortable thing to do. This can be dangerous because if the blade breaks, it's coming in this direction. And also, it's hard to tell where the blade is. It's hard to see. It's hard to tell exactly where it is. So operating it from the right side is not as safe. We operate it from the front, and you might have a helper on the back. You want nice flat material, and you want it flat against the table. However, if you did have a cylindrical material, like a round log or branch, you don't want to just run that by hand, because as you go to cut that, it tends to want to spin and bring your fingers towards the blade, which isn't safe. So if you've got round or shapes that are not flat to the table, then we need to set up an additional safety measure in place to make that cut. So if you're cutting correctly and carefully, then we shouldn't have issues with broken blades, but it does happen occasionally. And so if a blade does break, then just turn the saw off. It's going to take a couple of minutes for it to spin down, and then come let me know so that I can make sure and get that blade replaced. Okay, so here's an example. Here I've drawn a shape for a push stick. I've got a little scrap piece of particle board, and it's the size that I could use for a push stick. So I've drawn my line here. I've got some straight lines and I've got some curved lines. Now, as I'm cutting around, this is the area that I'm worried about, because if I get stuck in that area, that's going to be really hard for me to back out without putting pressure on the blade. It is okay to back out of a cut on the bandsaw, but you don't want to put pressure on your blade. So in this area, I'm going to do what's called a relief cut. With a relief cut, I'm going to cut straight in and then back out, so that as I come around and cut here, then that piece of material falls off and I'm not stuck in that area, and I can move or reposition as needed. So here's an example of the bandsaw. Now that I have an offcut, sometimes the urge is to try to move it out of the way, but we definitely don't want to clear our offcuts while the blade is still running. So I'm just going to leave that offcut there and allow it to get pushed out of the way with my other material. I'm going to do a relief cut right here as well. I'll turn off my blade and allow it to spin down. Once your blade is spun down, then it's okay to remove the other material. And be sure not to leave material like this here at the saw for the next person. Make sure to clean up your offcuts and leave the table area clean. So that was a good example. You notice that it took several cuts. It doesn't all happen at once. You can back out and turn as needed. If you look closely, you'll see that I didn't cut very accurately to my line. On a push stick, that doesn't really matter, but on a project, that actually would matter. So typically on the bandsaw, you're gonna cut close to, but not on the line that you've drawn. And then you can go and finish and use a sander to sand perfectly to your line. But a push stick is a great little project. If you've never used a bandsaw before and you just wanna have a little experience with it, then doing something like a push stick is a great project because it doesn't really matter how perfect it turns out. Okay, I'm finished here at the bandsaw, and now I just wanna make sure that I've left it ready for the next person. So I clean off the table of any scraps, make sure to throw those away, make sure that you don't leave any on the floor if they've dropped down below. And then I wanna make sure that I leave my blade guard height basically at the bottom, okay? Or, not more than an inch from the bottom. If you're leaving several inches of that blade exposed, then that's just unnecessarily dangerous for the next person. I'll just briefly go through an example of turning on the other two bandsaws so that you know what they look like. So I'm here at the blue Bailey bandsaw, which has a 1/2 inch blade. And on this one, we've got our on button here and our off button here. This off button sticks in, so if you come up to the saw and you can't turn it on, make sure that you've twisted that knob and pulled it out so that you're able to turn on the saw. Here on the Laguna, it's slightly different. You want to make sure when you're ready to turn it on that this red knob is pulled out. You also want to make sure if it's not turning on to check the foot pedal. The spring on the inside of this foot lever is a little tired, so sometimes it doesn't pull the foot pedal all the way up. So if you just bump that up with your toe, then you should be able to turn it on. And then this one has a black twist knob to turn on. So that's the bandsaw. Use it carefully and follow all the safety guidelines.